We'll call this meeting of Lima City Council to order. We'll begin tonight's meeting with the invocation by Councilor Gordon, followed by the Pledge of Allegiance.
Lord in heaven, we come to you in Jesus' most precious name. We ask you to be with us as we make decisions for your people in Lima, Ohio, and support us and help us make these choices that are tough decisions, and make sure that in our minds and in our hearts, they're for your people. Amen.
Amen.
I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Will the clerk call the roll?
Mr. Gordon?
Here.
Mr. McLean?
Here.
Mr. Lowe?
Here.
Mr. Tebben?
Here.
Miss Adams?
Here.
Mr. Glenn?
Here.
Mrs. Miles?
Here.
And Mr. Nixon.
Here. There are no scheduled public hearings nor privilege of the floor. Consent calendar.
Mr. President, I move that item A of the consent calendar be received, filed, and approved, and item B be received and filed.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive, file, and approve item A, and to receive and file item B. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number one.
From the Director of Human Resources regarding labor consulting services.
Mr. President,
Mr. Lowe.
I move that communication number one be received and filed.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive and file communication number one. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed?
Aye.
The council want to authorize legislation?
Yeah.
Mr. President,
Mr. Lowe.
I move that communication number one be received and filed and let the, with the necessary legislation.
Second.
Okay, the motion and the second is to receive and file communication number one and to authorize the necessary legislation. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of that motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed?
Aye.
That was 2.
3.
We'll take a roll call. Those in favor of the motion?
Mr. Gordon?
Yes.
Mr. McLean?
No.
Mr. Lowe?
No.
Mr. Tebben?
Yes.
Mrs. Adams?
Yes.
Miss Adams, sorry. Mr. Glenn?
No.
And Mrs. Miles?
Yes.
And Mr. Nixon.
Yes. Motion carries 5-3. Communication number two.
From the Director of Human Resources regarding seasonal pay scale.
Mr. President,
Mr. Lowe.
I move that communication number two be received and filed.
Second.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive and file communication number two. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number three.
From the Data Systems Manager regarding legislation to enter into a contract for data network and phone services.
Mr. President,
Mrs. Miles.
I move that communication number 3 be received and filed. Legislation is on tonight's agenda.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive and file communication number three. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number four.
From Chief Hefner regarding legislation to enter into a contract with Insight Public Sector.
Mr. President,
Mr. Gordon.
I move that communication number 4 be received and filed.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive and file communication number four. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number five.
From Chief Martin regarding legislation to disperse funds from the Law Enforcement Trust Fund account.
Mr. President,
Mr. Gordon.
I move that communication number 5 be received and filed.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive and file communication number five. Is there any discussion? I've got a point. Do we need to authorize legislation on that?
It's on,
I mean,
I
is it
believe
on
it's
tonight?
on.
It's
Yeah.
on tonight.
Okay, just said I'm requesting authorization, that's all. Any further discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? Motion carries. Communication number 6.
From Chief Martin regarding legislation to apply for a Justice Assistance Grant Program.
Mr. President,
Mr. Gordon?
I move that communication number 6 be received and filed.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive and file communication number 6. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number 7.
From Chief Martin regarding legislation to apply for a grant from the Ohio Department of Public Safety.
Mr. President,
Mr. Gordon?
I move that communication number 7 be received and filed.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive and file communication number 7. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number 8.
From Chief Martin requesting legislation to enter into an agreement with the Ohio Law Enforcement Support Office.
Mr. President,
Mr. Gordon?
I move that communication number 8 be received and filed.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive and file communication number 8. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number 9.
From the Finance Director regarding legislation for the 2014 sidewalk notes.
Mr. President,
Mr. Tevin?
I move that communication number 9 be received and filed. Legislation is on tonight's agenda.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive and file communication number 9. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number 10.
From the Director of Community Development regarding legislation to place tax assessments.
Mr. President,
Mr. Glenn?
I move that communication number 10, receive and file legislation on the night agenda.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive and file communication number 10. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number 11.
From the Director of Community Development regarding legislation to expend funds from the Ohio local government.
Mr. President,
Mr. Glenn?
I move that communication number 11, receive and file legislation on the night agenda.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive and file communication number 11. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number 12.
From the Director of Public Works regarding legislation to accept donations of real property.
Mr. President,
Ms. Adams?
I move that communication number 12 be received and filed. The legislation is on tonight's agenda.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive and file communication number 12. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number 13.
From the Director of Public Works regarding legislation to enter into a contract for building official services.
Mr. President,
Ms. Adams?
I move that communication number 13 be received and filed. Legislation is on tonight's agenda.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive and file communication number 13. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed?
Aye.
Did I count just two?
Counted two.
Okay, thank you. The motion has been approved. Communication number 14.
From the Director of Public Works regarding legislation to enter into a contract with American Structure Point, Inc.
Mr. President,
Ms. Adams?
I move that communication number 14 be received and filed. Legislation is on tonight's agenda.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive and file communication number 14. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number 15.
From the Director of Public Works requesting legislation to enter into a contract with Miller Cable Company.
Mr. President,
Ms. Adams?
I move that communication number 15 be received and filed. Legislation is on tonight's agenda.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive and file communication number 15. Is there any discussion?
Mr. President,
Ms. Adams?
I just wanted to say thank you for making note of the projects again that this covers, the intersections and the type of work that would be done in your communication. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Adams. Is there any further discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number 16.
From the Director of Public Works regarding legislation to modify Chapter 864 of the codified ordinances.
Mr. President,
Ms. Adams?
I move that communication number 16 be received and filed. Legislation is on tonight's agenda.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive and file communication number 16. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. There are no petitions, reports of officials, ordinances. 11714.
Providing for the issuance and sale of $114,700 in notes in anticipation of the issuance of bonds to pay the property owner's portion in anticipation of the levy and collection of special assessments of the cost of constructing sidewalks at various locations in the city, together with all necessary appurtenances thereto.
Mr. President,
Mr. Tevin?
I move that the fiscal officer certificate be received.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive the fiscal officer's certificate. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Mr. Tevin?
Mr. President, I move that ordinance 117-14 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 11714 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Gordon?
Yes.
Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
Miss Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Mrs. Miles?
Yes.
And Mr. Nixon.
Yes. Ordinance 11714 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 11814.
Levying special assessments for property maintenance code charges on premises in the city of Lima, Ohio.
Mr. President,
Mr. Glenn?
I move that ordinance 11814 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 11814 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Gordon?
Yes.
Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
Miss Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Mrs. Miles?
Yes.
And Mr. Nixon.
Yes. Ordinance 11814 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 11914.
Authorizing the mayor to advertise for bids and enter into a contract to sell scrap iron, steel, copper, and brass.
Mr. President,
Ms. Miles?
I move that ordinance number 119-14 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 11914 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Gordon?
Yes.
Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
Miss Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Mrs. Miles?
Yes.
And Mr. Nixon.
Yes. Ordinance 11914 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 12014.
Authorizing the mayor to enter into a contract with Perry Protech.
Mr. President,
Ms. Miles?
I move that ordinance number 120-14 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 12014 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Gordon?
Yes.
Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
Miss Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Mrs. Miles?
Yes.
And Mr. Nixon.
Yes. Ordinance 12014 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 12114.
Authorizing the mayor to enter into a contract with CenturyLink.
Mr. President,
Mrs. Miles?
I move that 121-14 ordinance be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 12114 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Gordon?
Yes.
Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
Miss Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Mrs. Miles?
Yes.
And Mr. Nixon.
Yes. Ordinance 12114 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 12214.
Authorizing the mayor to apply for, accept, and administer funds from the U.S. Department of Justice for the 2014 JAG Local Solicitation Program Grant.
Mr. President,
Mr. Gordon?
I move that ordinance 12214 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 12214 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Gordon?
Yes.
Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
Miss Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Mrs. Miles?
Yes.
And Mr. Nixon.
Yes. Ordinance 12214 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 12314.
Authorizing the mayor to apply for, accept, and administer funds from the Ohio Department of Justice Public Safety FFY 2015 Impaired Driving Enforcement Grant.
Mr. President,
Mr. Gordon.
I move that ordinance 12314 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 12314 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Gordon?
Yes.
Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
Miss Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Mrs. Miles?
Yes.
And Mr. Nixon.
Yes. Ordinance 12314 is to pass on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 12414.
Authorizing the mayor to apply for, accept, and administer funds from the Ohio Department of Justice Public Safety 2015 Selective Traffic Enforcement Program Grant.
Mr. President,
Mr. Gordon.
I move that ordinance 12414 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 12414 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Gordon?
Yes.
Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
Miss Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Mrs. Miles?
Yes.
And Mr. Nixon.
Yes. Ordinance 12414 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 12514.
Authorizing payment to the West Central Ohio Crime Task Force from the Law Enforcement Trust Fund account.
Mr. President,
Mr. Gordon.
I move that ordinance 12514 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 12514 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Gordon?
Yes.
Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
Miss Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Mrs. Miles?
Yes.
And Mr. Nixon.
Yes. Ordinance 12514 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 12614.
Authorizing the mayor to enter into a contract with Insight Public Sector.
Mr. President,
Mr. Gordon.
I move that ordinance 12614 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 12614 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Gordon?
Yes.
Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
Miss Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Mrs. Miles?
Yes.
And Mr. Nixon.
Yes, ordinance 12614 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 12714.
Authorizing the mayor to enter into a contract with Miller Cable Company to construct the various intersection improvement projects.
Mr. President,
Ms. Adams.
I move that ordinance 127-14 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 12714 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? Have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Gordon?
Yes.
Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
Miss Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Mrs. Miles?
Yes.
And Mr. Nixon.
Yes, ordinance 12714 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 12814.
Authorizing the mayor to enter into a contract with American Structure Point, Inc.
Mr. President,
Ms. Adams.
I move that ordinance 128-14 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 12814 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Gordon?
Yes.
Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
Miss Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Mrs. Miles?
Yes.
And Mr. Nixon.
Yes, ordinance 12814 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 12914.
Authorizing the mayor to accept donations and purchase certain real property and temporary right-of-way for the Alkippy Street project.
Mr. President,
Ms. Adams.
I move that ordinance 129-14 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 12914 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Gordon?
Yes.
Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
Miss Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Mrs. Miles?
Yes.
And Mr. Nixon.
Yes, ordinance 12914 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Excuse me. Ordinance 13014.
Authorizing the mayor to apply for, accept, and administer funds from the Ohio Development Services Agency Local Government Innovation Grant.
Mr. President,
Mr. Glenn?
I move that ordinance 130-14 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 13014 on its first reading. Is there any discussion?
Mr. President?
Mr. Lowe?
Yeah, I was wondering, I had a discussion this week with Ms. Odom, and I would like to know if she would come forward so those at home would understand the benefit of this.
Mr. President,
So-
council members, Mr. Lowe, thank you. Again, this is an application, so it is no guarantee. We have to make an application and submit it in early June, and we'll not know in July if we receive the funds. However, if we do receive the funds, this is a Ohio Local Government Innovation Grant, which is specifically given to communities for interjurisdictional cooperation. The state wants to see communities working together. I know, say that fast 3 times, Mr. President.
I'm sorry, I'm fighting allergies. so
Okay.
Excuse me, I'm not trying to be rude.
What we're attempting to do is to work most closely with downtown Lima, with the city of Lima, and county commissioners and the Regional Planning Commission to do an inventory, basically, starting with the buildings in downtown Lima to find out what their economic viability is, meaning what can they be used for, what are they currently being used for, and can we find a better way to attract more users. Once that information is available, an economic analysis will be done. Again, that's our proposal. This is the proposal we'll be making to the state of Ohio. We won't know until July if our grant application is accepted, but we appreciate the opportunity. Okay?
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any further discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Gordon?
Yes.
Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tebben?
Yes.
Miss Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Mrs. Miles?
Yes.
And Mr. Nixon.
Yes, ordinance 13014 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 13114.
Amending Chapter 864 of the Codified Ordinances of Lima, Ohio.
Mr. President,
Miss Adams?
I move that ordinance 131-14 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 13114 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? We'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Gordon?
Yes.
Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tebben?
Yes.
Miss Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Mrs. Miles?
Yes.
And Mr. Nixon.
Yes, ordinance 13114 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 13214.
Enacting Chapter 1034, Street Naming, Renaming, and Honorary Street Naming of the Codified Ordinances of Lima, Ohio.
Mr. President,
Miss Adams?
I move that ordinance 132-14 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 13214 on its first reading. Is there any discussion?
Mr. President,
Miss Adams?
we held 2 meetings concerning this issue in committee, which I reported out, but I'd like to thank the members of the committee for their input and the administration and other counselors that attended. I think it was a good discussion, feedback, suggestions from all sides, and hopefully this is a good, workable piece of legislation to go forward in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Miss Adams. Is there any further discussion? I just want to commend your committee on this, because while it seems like a rather simple issue, the more you delve into it, the more complicated it becomes in terms of fairness and its full application. And I think that the committee meetings and the dialogue that were held were good, and I think you did a good job in addressing everyone's concerns. And I think you've got a piece of legislation that probably won't need a whole lot of tampering with or adjustment going forward. So all of the committee members, I want to congratulate on dealing with that issue. A little more complicated than it looked on the surface, okay? So, if there's no further discussion, I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Gordon?
Yes.
Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tebben?
Yes.
Miss Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Mrs. Miles?
Yes.
And Mr. Nixon.
Yes, ordinance 13214 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 13314.
Authorizing the mayor to enter into a contract for certified building official and administrative services.
Mr. President,
Ms. Adams?
I move that ordinance 133-14 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 133-14 on its first reading. Is there any discussion?
Mr. President,
Ms. Adams?
I just want to make 2 points in looking at this. This is a one-year contract once it is going to be enacted from the time it's signed. And the amount that was stated on the communication and here of $82,000 annually, which is not to exceed, also includes any fees to an agency employment service, is to come out of that, not in addition to, is my understanding.
Mr. President.
Mr. Geiger.
I would ask the administration to clarify their intent for the actual contract as to whether it would be a one-year or a multi-year contract. The way the ordinance is written, it would allow for multi-year, and given Ms. Adams your understanding that it's only 1 year, I want to make sure everybody's on the same page in that regard.
Mr. Elstro?
Mr. President, Council, it is the intention of the administration for this to be an ongoing contractual basis. That's not to say that adjustments cannot be discussed going on, but as we presented this ordinance, certainly this first fiscal year, the fee will not be $82,000, but I wanted to be very clear that on an ongoing basis, you can expect $82,000 to be the total amount of the contract on an annual basis. And again, this is will be cheaper than the current method, and will keep us as a certified building department. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Elstro. Any further, Ms. Adams?
No. Thank you, Mr. Geiger.
Is there any further discussion?
Mr. President,
Mr. Gordon?
I've struggled with this issue back and forth over the last few days, and but with the circumstances and the certifications that the individual has to have, today I just want to say that I will be supporting this issue.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Gordon. Is there any further discussion?
Mr. President,
Mrs. Miles?
I want to say too that in light of the situation, which this particular position requires extensive certification that doesn't happen, very easily, or it takes time. And also because of, again, the circumstances of this individual here, I mean, with the rules, retirement rules changing here, a lot of things have prompted this particular request. And again, as has been stated to me, and when I talked to Mr. Elstro, I asked a lot of questions about this, which everybody was given an opportunity, to speak to him about any concerns they have. I asked him about a plan A, a plan B, and he kind of explained to me what his plans are. We have asked for a succession plan, and I believe Mr. Elstro has one in place. It may not happen as quickly as we would like to see it happen, but he does. He indeed has a succession plan. So I too will be voting for this.
Thank you, Mrs. Miles. Mr. McLean?
Thank you, Mr. President. I've been torn with this for about a week, and I've talked to Howard. I've talked to Bill Brown personally. I've also talked to several of their employees in the department. And, I still have some questions that I can't get straight in my mind. I would have liked to have seen this go to a committee. I would have certainly hoped that we could have had some more in-depth discussion and me doing a little more investigation. Worst thing I hate is when we get these ordinances set up on a Friday and we have to come in and vote on them on a Monday. It gets pretty stressful for, I don't know about the rest of the council, but it gets pretty stressful for me because I try to find out as much as I can so I can vote effectively. And when I can't vote effectively, I don't feel I've done justice to my constituents in the city. So in this particular time, I don't have enough information, and I'm going to vote no. Not that this is a bad idea or a good idea. I can't tell you if it is. So if I had more time, I could probably get a better stamp on it. But right now, I don't have it, and I'm going to vote no for that very reason.
Thank you, Mr. McLean. Is there any further discussion?
Mr. President,
Mr. Tevin?
I didn't see this Friday night for the first time I hear about it, and I had an opportunity to ask Mr. Elstro questions and get answers that led me to feel comfortable with the legislation, and I will be supporting it.
Thank you, Mr. Tevin. Is there any further discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Gordon,
Yes.
Mr. McLean,
No?
Mr. Lowe,
No.
Mr. Tevin,
Yes.
Miss Adams,
Yes.
Mr. Glenn,
Yes.
Mrs. Miles,
Yes.
and Mr. Nixon.
Yes. Ordinance 13314 has been passed on its first reading by a 6-2 vote. Miscellaneous business, Mr. Gordon.
The only thing I have tonight, Mr. President, is to remind people to be good to each other. That's it.
Thank you, Mr. Gordon.
Should have brought that up in pre-council.
Mr. McLean.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just one item. Tomorrow evening will be the Northside Neighborhood Association meeting. That will be held at St. Gerard's. We're not sure if it's going to be in the cafeteria of the parish hall yet. Just look for the cars. You'll see us there. So that's at 7 p.m. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Mr. Lowe.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also have a neighborhood association announcement to make. I had an individual approach me last week and asked about the east side, getting back together and doing what we need to be doing. They are willing to be a secretary, but I'm also in search of a president. We need a president, so I'm going to put this plea out for the 10th time. If there's anyone on the east side of Lima, 3rd Ward, that would like to be the president of the East Side Neighborhood Association, please get in contact with me. I also had, I want to say congratulations to all the class of 2014, and be safe. And this past 2 weeks, our Civic Center has been extremely busy. There's been a couple of dance recitals. There was a graduation. I believe there was 2 different graduations. Parking downtown has been busy, very, very busy. And being a new business downtown, one of the things that I would never do, and would pray that other businesses in downtown wouldn't do, is complain about seeing individuals coming downtown. And there was a certain business that did that. We're not going to call names, but it came down to time limits on parking. So at this time, I would like to refer the issue of downtown parking time limits to the Traffic Commission.
Second.
Motion and the second is to refer the issue of downtown parking limits, time limits in the downtown area to the Traffic Commission.
Yes, sir.
All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, the motion carries.
Mr. President,
Mr. Mayor?
in that regard, is there something that you're asking the Traffic Commission to do?
Yes, there was certain,
Mr. Lowe, do you want the time limits, assume you're talking about 15-minute time limits. Do you want
There was-
those lifted or expanded?
expanded.
Okay, so to review the expansion of limited time parking in the downtown.
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
all right. Is there anything further?
Nothing further.
All right, thank you. Mr. Tevin?
Tuesday evening, I attended the beginning of the meeting of Lakewood West Neighborhood Association, this group is trying to revitalize themselves, and it was held at the LACNIP Center at Old Fire Station number 4. And it was good to see, some of the familiar faces out there revitalizing that neighborhood association, and hopefully they have a lot of success, and I'm ready to help them accomplish their goals. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tevin. Ms. Adams?
Thank you, Mr. President. A few items this evening. First, wish everyone a safe Memorial Day holiday and remember those that have gone before us. Midway East will be having a dumpster located at Meat City on Kibbe Street Saturday, May 31st from 9 to 12. There's no sites this weekend being the holiday weekend. So the next opportunity will be May 31st, Saturday from 9 to 12 at Kibbe Kibbe Street at Meat City. Yesterday, I had the pleasure to attend, and also read the article in the Lima News in Beaver Dam, the dedication of their new town hall. It's a great facility. Residents there should take pride in their building and technology that's been put in place. It was a wonderful ceremony and beautiful day, and I appreciate that. I'd like to ask Mr. Elstro, now that we've passed the legislation for the honorary street names, is it your department that'll be coming up with the application? And I know we had a sample from about 7 years ago. Do you know the turnaround of that application once this, 30 days from now, one will be available for the, because we've had a counselor, Mr. Glenn, who's been patiently waiting. And I'd like to inform him, I want to sign it when he gets it, so if you could, please.
Mr. President.
Mr. Elstro.
Ms. Adams is correct. It's been quite a while since we had the initial honorary name petition before you all, and you passed it tonight. I would say, yes, give us 30 days to make sure we have the final application and all the processes in place. I think most everything is outlined by the ordinance, but to both train staff and go through it with them, I think is going to be necessary. So I would say we'd be open for business in about 30 days. Thank you.
Middle, 1st of July?
Yes.
Okay.
Great, thank you, Mr.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Mr.
Mr.
Elstro.
Elstro.
That's all I had this evening. Thank you.
Ms. Adams. Mr. Glenn?
I got a couple things here. First of all, I'd like to congratulate my niece, who graduated from Spillman, and they graduation was today, on Monday. But I'd like to congratulate her on that. That's a tough school to be at. It's in Atlanta, all-girls school. A lot of predominant peoples went there, and we're happy for her. Also, I want to thank all the folks. We had some visitors came to town, and like Mr. Lowe said, our downtown was pretty packed. It's very exciting when you see that. And the guys that came in, they came around, look at a couple things in our community. They liked the way our Y is built, and they liked the way we were structured there to be a small city. And they talk about the finance and stuff like that, that we are doing really good in our finance department compared to some other cities. But we had a good opportunity to go around both sides of the 6th Ward. And we looked at the people, different ways of life. How could we work on that to change that? What can we do to make it better for some of the people? And we talked about jobs. So I appreciate them coming out. And it was a rainy day, kind of cold light, but we got through it. Appreciate them. Also, I want to make sure that we are trying to work on bringing back some of the neighborhood associations that slowed down a little bit. We're going to try to pick them back up, so we're going to get around there and try to work with some of them. I got some folks going to help out with that. We're going to rejuvenate some of them and get them back going again. Just a little bit kickstart on some of the things. That's all we need, and we can get them back and going again. Also, I want to thank Eric. Eric, you stand up real quick. And I appreciate all the work he had done. We have a crossing of Reese and 4th Street. On May the 9th, me and Eric went out. He called me and said, Mr. Glenn, they running through the stoplight. On May 9th, from 3 to 5, we had 20 trucks and cars and motorcycles went through the stoplight. On May the 8th, from 2 to 5, we had 35 cars went through the stoplight, trucks and cars. On May the 14th, we had 25 cars went through the stoplight. And on May the 15th, we had 25 more cars that went through the stoplight. Now, Eric did some of these days, and I came out, did some of the days because he had to end up going out of town. So we sat right there on the church lot. When people see me, they wave at me and go through the light. And but it's very, very dangerous. A lot of people could have been dead if they came down Reese Street when they went through, because the light was green on Reese when they coming through. And it's very dangerous. So I'll be contacting, I'm going to be with Chief on that, and also the highway patrolman on that. They're going too fast now. Unfortunately, we already know it's a truck route, We got a lot of babies getting out of school, you know, and then watching the kids getting out of school, trying to cross through there, go to the 4th Street apartments, go to Chestnut area, the cars is going too fast. And I appreciate Eric for taking the time out to be a concerned citizen. And that's what we're going to continue having, real concerned citizens that are watching this and got us, you know, and we're going to bring a camera out. If it don't happen, you know, we're going to bring a camera out. And I don't matter who get upset about it, but, you know, and I know 95, a lot of folks is not living in the city of Lima. It's coming from work, trying to get home. One lady told me when I was out there, what you expect me to do? She turned back around and said, what you expect me to do, Mr. Glenn? I'm not going to sit at that light for somebody to rob me, you know? And I disagree with that. You take somebody's life away just to go through that light, you know? I'm not here to write tickets, but it's being reported to the Highway Patrolman and also the city of Lima, you know, and also Perry Township, but they be coming through there a little bit sometime too, because that's not right that you have to fly through that light like that with them kids getting out of school and no one, you know, we thought they was going to stop for the school bus. I mean, they was anxious to get out of there and nobody breaking down at all. So we're going to make sure we get that taken care, and I appreciate Eric so much for taking the time out. Also, I'd like to thank all the folks in there that really are doing a great job. You know, we talked to some of the folks Friday, and they needed some work done. We got some good volunteers, and I'm just excited about it. Just pick the phone up, actually want to help out with this, and everybody's saying yes. You know, and I don't like no one to talk down, no people, nobody, not in the 6th Ward, nowhere in the Lima, in the city of Lima. But I do not appreciate anybody talking anybody down. I will not accept that, but I respect that. But I'm not going to accept it. You know, I'll let you know that, you know, please don't do that. If people's not poor, some poor, and they trying to come back up, you know, but don't do that. You know, that hurts real bad. Yeah, I do care about the people, and I don't want no one telling me I care too much about the people. Don't tell me that, because that's my choice. That's my choice, and that's my feeling, and that's what God blessed me with, to help people, and I will continue helping them. Also, we're going to work on make sure everyone get to the parade Monday, and we're going to try to put together. I will be giving the newspaper about it. We're going to be putting some things together so we can make sure we can give everybody food after the parade, and we're working on that right now. The committee didn't get everything touched up, so I can't bring it up right now, but I will have the newspaper sometime this week. They'll tell you where we're going to be at. And that's it. Everybody have a great Memorial Day.
Thank you, Mr. Glenn. Mrs. Miles?
Pretty much same as already been stated. Congratulations to all the high school graduates throughout Allen County. And of course, again, a happy and safe Memorial Day. And lastly, the Neighborhood Concerns Committee will be meeting on Monday, June 2nd in council chambers. This is in regards to farm animals and fowl in the city. Again, that is June 2nd, 6:30 p.m. in council chambers.
Hold on. June 2nd, we have a council meeting.
June 9th.
Yeah, she's
Is it
right.
tonight?
Yeah.
June 9th. It got changed, Mr. President, when you started waving.
No, it didn't get
It
changed.
didn't get changed? I thought it got changed.
No, it's on the calendar for June.
It is the 9th, okay. So the
Okay.
9th and the 20th. Okay,
I did my homework.
Yeah.
that's fine.
You should
Thank you.
Because she brought it to me.
I was just talking to
I
Sally
should have
earlier
caught
about
that
when the
when,
dates were for the June.
that's why I
meeting, so.
hesitated when you said that without my little sketch.
Yeah.
June 9th.
That's all I have.
Thank you. I guess first off, I want to recognize, I guess we have two students from Bath High School here for, pardon me?
Miss David.
And that's government or civics?
Government.
Government, okay. Now, are you guys seniors?
Junior.
Juniors, okay, I was going to say, you're cutting it pretty close for graduation, aren't you? Welcome, and I hope you've learned anything. If you have any questions, please talk to any of us afterwards, okay? Also like to send congratulations out to all of the area graduates. You guys might know my nephew, who's graduating this weekend at Bath, Eric Jordan. Well, pardon me?
Baseball.
Yes, okay. Tell him I said congratulations. Couple of things that I do want to bring up, number one, I want to refer to the Traffic Commission study on the need for traffic lights at Elm and West and Elm and Elizabeth. I'd like to have that referred to the Traffic Commission. I'll make that
Second.
motion. Motion the second is to refer the issue of traffic lights at Elm and West and Elm and Elizabeth to the Traffic Commission. Any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. The other item that I'd like to, I guess, refer both to the administration and also, Mr. Law Director, if I can do this, refer it to the Public Works Committee at the same time to allow for future discussion. I've seen these before, and somebody had suggested it, and I've seen them in other cities, but the notion of dog parks. And I'd like to just know if it's feasible to do within our existing parks. They're basically kind of a large fenced-in area where people can take their dogs and just let them run unleashed in a park in a bit of a confined area, but sizable enough that they can get some exercise. And I'm not saying I'm going to be banging for this thing hard, but I'd like to know if it's something that would enhance our park system and be of benefit to the residents, and then have it referred to Public Works Committee tonight, so that at the time the administration's ready to discuss that it's already referred and that conversation can go forward. So that's my motion to refer the issue of dog parks to the Public Works Committee.
Second.
Those in favor of the motion, or is there any discussion on that motion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? The motion carries. Lastly, I just want to wish everybody a very happy and safe Memorial Day. Don't forget to take a few minutes and remember those who have served this country and sacrificed their time, their years, their lives to protect the freedoms that we enjoy. That's what Memorial Day truly is about. Mr. Mayor?
Mr. President, just to have one announcement. My daughter Jennifer had presented us with a third grandchild this past Tuesday.
All right.
And
Congratulations.
very healthy, 8.3-pound little boy. And now, had the baby been born the week before, it could have been on my birthday, but it wasn't. The baby didn't arrive until Mike Caprella's birthday.
Oh, no.
So he's now agreed.
Does he have any hair?
No, he doesn't.
He doesn't. He looks
doesn't
like
have any
Caprella
hair.
already.
But Mike has now agreed to chip into his college education, and I just wanted to thank him for that.
Mike, what's another?
Beanie.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
If there's no further business,
Mr. President?
Mr. Glenn?
Yeah, I forgot, Blue Lake Church did a good job, and Chief Martin was there, and a lot of different county was there. They did a great job at their church, recognizing the community service work that we do in the line of duty, and they had a great speaker, and I really appreciate that. And, we had Lieutenant Coombs was there, wasn't it? Yeah, he did a great job there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Glenn. Mr. Tevin?
Mr. President, I move that Lima City Council adjourn until June the 9th at 7 PM in these chambers.
Second.
The motion on the second is that City Council adjourn until June 9th at 7 PM in these chambers. Is there any discussion on the motion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Council is adjourned.